Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast, where foreign aid partners connect to learn about key funding trends and market insight. The podcast is co-hosted by Aid Connect Data, the pipeline and market intel software for USAID partnering, and Connected International, the leading USAID partnering support consulting firm. Now, here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Hello and welcome to this very special episode of the Aid Market Podcast. Our guest today is David Beasley. He was the former governor of South Carolina and the former executive director of the World Food Program. He ran the World Food Program in 2020 when they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. On today's episode, we cover global food security, the story of them winning the Nobel Peace Prize, what that does to their messaging, and we talk about communications and messaging and how to talk about foreign aid and to support the justification for a robust foreign aid budget. I hope you enjoy the episode. This is co-hosted with the Society for International Development US. He was the keynote speaker at their dinner recently in Washington, D.C. I'm on the board of SID US. It is, in my opinion, the best association for USAID partners. Anyone looking to work with USAID, especially those new partners coming into the market, join the SID membership. Come to the annual dinner, come to the conference, get engaged with our members on our virtual events and the in-person work that we do in DC, across the country, and around the world. So with that, enjoy this episode. David, thank you so much for joining me on the Aid Market Podcast. It's a pleasure to meet you. We're here at the SID annual dinner. You're going to be the keynote speaker tonight, and appreciate you taking a little bit of time before the dinner to kind of share your thoughts on global food security and international development for those who aren't able to attend the dinner tonight.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you. So, David, first, can you talk a little bit about what you see for global food security, global food insecurity? What are some of the main issues that you see today?
Well, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as we would say. The good is how much progress we've made in the last 200 years. When you think about 200 years ago, 95% of the people were in poverty or extreme poverty, and now less than 10%. That's the good news. We have built systems. We've achieved so many good things. Now we're going backwards. That's the bad news. And the ugly news is it's going to get worse. And so there's no more important time than right now to zero in on international development. It needs to be strategic. It needs to be effective because the poorest of the poor need our help. And I try to explain to young people who are really confused and distraught out there. I'm like, look, be careful. Don't tear down systems that are reaching the 90% to reach the 10. Now, I need for you to be a voice because that 10% is like, well, it's not working for me. So how do we reach that last 10% around the world? How do we do the international development that brings hope and stability and things that are so obvious in our face today that are destabilizing, and mass migration and famines that we're facing, and of course war, conflict, COVID implications, and climate shocks and things like that. So there's a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot of success stories. How do we build on those success stories? How do we not repeat the failed stories? And how do we move the ball forward? Because right now we're, in my opinion, we're at a global crossroads.
So as you're talking we're in Washington, D.C. right now, as you're talking with people on both sides of the aisle, how do you talk about the importance or what role international development, foreign aid funding should play in the global security market?
Yeah, it's not a complicated message. And in fact, when I got talked into being the executive director of the World Food Program, that was the point I was making to a lot of folks. This is, well, wait a minute, why do you want me to do this? Well, you can message, yada, yada, yada. And then so I immediately began going directly. Trump was talking about zeroing out the budget, which he did. Republicans and Democrats were talking about cutting international aid. But that wasn't just in the United States. It was also in Germany, the UK, and many other countries which are major funders in the international scene of development. And so I asked a lot of particularly some of my liberal friends, I said, give me the flexibility to talk the language that will appeal to the different constituencies within your parliament. And they knew what I was saying. And I said, I can't just go give the normal UN lingo and language. That won't work. And so I would make it real simple. It's like, it's going to cost you 1,000 times more if you don't do this. Now, let me run some numbers by you. This is not hypothetical. This is not unrealistic. This is reality, experiential data. Here's what it's going to cost you if you do it. Here's what it's going to cost you if you don't do it. And when you lay it out, and I do little simple examples. So like if you got leaking water lines in the ceiling, and it costs you $100 to go up there and fix it. You don't have $100, so you don't fix it. Well, a month later, you got to replace the flooring, the table, the carpet, the curtains, and it's thousands of dollars. There's no option C here. And you can talk about immigration all day long, but for example, on the border, Washington Post did an article, $3,750 per week per child at the border. For $1 to $2 per week, we can have a development program feeding that child with sustainability. So Mr. Extreme anti-immigrant voter or congressman, $2, $30,750. Which one you want? Well, I want that. I said, exactly. But you need to fund that. Otherwise, you will be paying for this. And so being practical and common sense and showing the effectiveness of these programs. And I think this is one of the things that as the UN and maybe in the international development community has failed to show the American people these success stories of why, if you're not going to do it out of the goodness of your heart, you better do it out of your national security interest and your financial interest. And I was like, wow, go help these families where they are. Give them hope, and they don't have to come here. We can end migration by necessity, by strategic international development. And then you're left with migration by choice. And that's a pleasant debate. That's a small number of people. We can handle that without any issue. And that destroys the divide on this issue. Anyway.
And ideally, creating trading partners and mutually economic,
yes.
mutually beneficial economic ties. Great.
That's the key.
You mentioned the World Food Program. Obviously, you're the executive director of the World Food Program. Can you talk a little bit about what your priorities were when you oversaw that, and then what you see as the role for that or the large multilaterals and bilateral donors?
You know, when I took this role, reluctantly, and it really was reluctantly, and the Democrat Republican senators said you have to do it, and that's a whole other story in itself. And looking back, you know, my children said, "Dad, being governor was great, but this has been the greatest job, and it was most fulfilling, life-changing experience. When you're helping the poorest of the poor around the world, there's nothing. You get more than you give. You know, you really do." And so I was thinking that I could put the World Food Program out of business. At that time, there were 80 million people in IPC 345. And I'm thinking 80 million people, population of the world at that time, 7.6 billion. Wow, we can, SDGs, eliminating hunger, poverty. I'm like, we can do that. Well, you know, war, conflict, COVID, everything just went backwards. So I knew that the number one thing I had to focus on immediately was raising money big time. And I was hoping that was not going to be the case, but it turned out it had to be the case. And so at the time, we were around a little less than $6 billion at the World Food Program. Trump zeroed out the budget, so that would drop us down to about $4 billion. So we had to work to restore that. And that actually wasn't that hard to do. And because I've had great relationships with both parties, both administrations, from the Obama administration to Trump administration, of course, now the Biden administration. And so we were able to make the case at the White House. As I say, it was a miracle on Pennsylvania Avenue, both ends. And so we went from $6 billion a year, and it's like $15 million a day was our burn rate, and we were raising about $15 million a day. So I knew with what we were facing out there that, all right, I'm going to try to raise $1 million per hour, 7 days a week, you know. And by the time we ended, with messaging, being strategic, going out to the war zones, going out to the natural disasters, coming to the capitals, being on the TV strategically, the last year we raised $14.4 billion, $39.4 million per day. But everything was very strategic, how we messaged, where we messaged, what we did, and what the consequences if you did not fund this. It wasn't just, we need to help the poor. Well, they got poor in their own, because you would get a congressman, a congresswoman saying, well, governor, a lot of them call me governor, we got funding needs for education in Iowa, bridge and infrastructure needs in Georgia, healthcare funding needs in South Carolina, or you might be in Bavaria or Kerry in Ireland. It could be anywhere. Same argument. And I'm like, well, let me explain it in ways that it will help you with your taxpayer. Why should I send money to Guatemala or Chad when I got funding needs right here? And when I explain it to them, they're like, I get that. And then I'll show them the experiential evidence of success. And they're like, wow, we like that. I'm like, that's what we're talking about. Now let's fund that. Let's do more of that. And that gets a little tricky sometimes because I think all of us are always struggling. USAID and different programs need a little more flexibility to be able to do more with less. And, that's always a struggle. But that should be a good tension, not a negative tension.
Could you get a little more into that how? How did you do that messaging? And maybe talk a little bit, obviously there's elections next year. Is there a difference in that how for a Republican administration versus a Democratic administration, or based on which constituents you're talking to, which state you're speaking in?
Yeah, and every candidate's got to, cater their message according to their constituency. And a Republican in sort of the more conservative areas, you're not going to run on that theme, but you need to be prepared to respond effectively. And this is what I would get from the Hill. My Democrat Republican friends said, Beasley, come speak to our committee because you have a way of speaking to everybody. You say it in a way that they can take it back home to their constituents. And so when somebody, let's say a right winger who's anti-international aid, and you say, well, let me tell you why you need to fund this. When you lay it out, they're like, oh, I didn't know that. I get that. Okay. Right? It's strategic, effective international aid. Are there wasteful programs? Yeah, well, there's wasteful programs in any government, any private sector, any business. And so we got to improve the system. That doesn't in any way take away from the reality. You're going to have mass migration. You're going to have destabilization if you don't do these things. And the best thing we can do is stabilize the environment, the politics, giving hope in our neighbors around the world. Whether it's in Mexico or Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. For example, as I was telling some of the congressmen, I said, you think the border in Mexico is a problem right now? We fed 160 million people last year. When you feed 160 million people, you know what they're thinking. It's not talking about one meal. I mean, you're talking about generally every other day or every day. So we know what they're thinking. Five times the number of people are talking about migrating now. So you go sit there and just continue to stick your head in the sand and do nothing, because doing nothing is why you're in this situation. But if we go down there and give them hope and give them food security, the migration drops off the chart because they don't want to leave home. I said, trust me, I've talked to these people. I've been to the Darien Gap. I've been in Syria. I've been in these places. They don't want to leave home, but if they can't feed their children, they go do what any mom and dad would do. So let's go help them because it's 1/100th the cost.
It's similar when I'll talk to anyone, I'll say, what would it take you to get up and leave your home, leave your family, and take a dangerous voyage on land, on sea? People are people. I think when you personalize it, it's like, wow, that would take quite a bit for someone to leave their home.
For every 1% increase in hunger, there's a 2% increase in migration. And so in Syria, for example, when we were surveying there, a Syrian family would move 2, 3, 4 times at least inside their country before they would leave their country. They would go to their cousins, their uncles, their aunts, their grandparents, a friend, because they didn't want to leave home. They've been living there. Their family's been there for thousands of years. But at some point, you have no choice. And, if we can get there in advance and stabilize the communities, because you care about them and they want to be home. In Africa, you give an African woman the same tools, holy mackerel. You want to learn about capitalism, the free entrepreneurial spirit, give African women the tools to take care of their family and feed themselves. You don't need to go to Harvard to learn capitalism. Go give the tools that an African woman needs for her community, her family. And I've got experiential evidence. I've seen it firsthand. That's what we've got to do. And it isn't that complicated.
So you talked obviously about the World Food Program. Nikki Haley was the UN ambassador at the time. My understanding, she nominated you to lead the World Food Program. Can you talk a little bit about that process and that relationship? And also, if you'd like to get into, obviously, we have the elections we talked about in 2024. And as all our listeners, both the staff at the donors, but also the organizations delivering food aid, doing education work globally, want to know, how should they be preparing? We talk as much as you want to get into, what would you anticipate potential foreign policy changes would be if it's a Nikki Haley or a Republican administration that comes in next year?
I'm not necessarily an expert in this, but what I have found in working in this role at the World Food Program was food is a powerful thing. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. I think that's why we won the Nobel Peace Prize, because we use food as a weapon of peace, of reconciling people, bringing people together, where others like to use it to weaponize war. And so I've said this many, many times. I said, we use food to even bring the Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate together. And I said, if it worked there, my gosh, it worked anywhere, And so it was quite remarkable with all the division in the Democrat and Republican House and Senate in particularly the last 10 years. They're just not getting along on hardly anything. But when I would go down there, meeting with the D's and the R's, it's just like they would lay aside their differences. They were so hungry for something that could bring them together for the good, because they truly understood the impact that food has on stability of nations around the world. If a child is hungry, and it took me a lot of messaging now to achieve that awareness, and the Nobel Peace Prize helped me elevate it to a whole nother level. But you've got to articulate it, you've got to meet with them, and you've got to spend the necessary time talking. I remember it was a couple years ago, and the Republican caucus in the Senate was meeting 49 of the Republican senators, and in the last minute they said, come talk to us, we're about to vote, and we think we got a voting problem on this aid package. And so I went and met with them like 15 minutes before the vote, and I talked to them for about 15 or 20 minutes, and I laid it out clearly. Here's where we are, here's what's going to happen if we don't fund it, and here's what we're doing, and here's why it will be strategic, effective, and save taxpayers' dollars in the United States. And it will also increase our national security and investment. And we got everybody's vote. It was just amazing to see them all come together. But there's so much distraction out there now. You got Gaza, you got Ukraine, you got this, you got that, and elections are coming. And so I do think on the Republican side, because I think there are an incredible number of D's and R's in the House and the Senate that get it. Mm-hmm. And that coalition of Democrats and Republicans, to me, is critical. I get a lot of calls, as you can imagine, from some of the Republican leaders on House and Senate come speak to some of the conservative groups. And I do. And I'll go say, hey, guys, you know me, and from South Carolina, I was conservative governor. Let me explain what's going on here. Let me explain why and what's the consequences of failure to do this. And the response is usually, okay, I get it. Now, if I can get them out to the field and let them see firsthand.
Is that more effective when you see see the projects, the implementation on the ground?
The last thing you need to show them is some UN report.
Yeah, okay.
That just does not go anywhere. The language, the lingo, all these acronyms, we don't even know what they mean, my first 6 months, I told everybody at the UN, do not use an acronym with me. If children are hungry, that's what I want to know. Are they starving? Are they hungry? Just keep it simple. And that was the messaging. I shifted the way of messaging. I caught some grief about it for the first 6 months from the UN. I'm like, trust me, if you keep speaking like that, I know what you mean. And the UN and USAID and other folks like that know what you mean. But the congressmen and senators and stuff, they don't know what you mean. And I said, and that's where you've got to go to get more money. So I would meet with the minister leaders in the different governments around the world. I said, give me the flexibility to talk to those members of the Bundestag or the members of the UK Parliament or Canadian Parliament. And so I can speak the language they understand, because they don't know all this stuff. They're so busy, so distracted with so many things. I said, let me hit them with a message that you might not like, but trust me. And then, of course, as our funding was going up, everybody started beginning to say, I see what you're doing now, And anyway, I've just been in that system long enough to know how these men and women think. Mm-hmm. Of course, nowadays it's getting complicated to see how they think.
Well, you mentioned the Nobel Peace Prize. I want to come back to that. On Ukraine quickly, what's your take on that situation? Obviously, there's the deal that was brokered with Turkey, but also not just what's going on in Ukraine, but how that impacts food security globally.
Well, we were concerned about the war beginning, and because we had a lot of people on all sides of this equation, and everybody was, oh, it's not going to happen. And we were like, no, we think it might happen. And while everybody was focused on the invasion on the Eastern Front, I immediately went to Odessa and did that
the
famous
port town in the Black Sea.
Yeah, because the Eastern Front was not the issue. The blockade on the entire coastline was an economic factor that would collapse the economy. And without the ports being open, Ukraine doesn't survive. And so I went down and did that famous tweet to Putin. Putin, if we don't open up these ports, you will bring famine to the rest of the world. And we got messages back channels that Russia did not want to be perceived as bringing famine to the rest of the world. So we took advantage of that messaging because it was real. And for many factors, the fertilizer productions that comes out of that region and the grain production, because Ukraine alone grows enough food to feed 400 million people. So anyway, we were able to negotiate the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which helped stabilize the commodity market around the world, along with many other dynamics. Well, anyway, when I stepped down in this year, the Black Sea Grain Initiative fell apart. I don't say it was me or anything like that, but it fell apart. And so you got fertilizer pricing, fuel costs, food costs, Russia hitting the infrastructure in Ukraine, from roads, bridges, trains, ports, to just completely devastate the Ukraine grain production, which Russia grain production and pricing will increase their profits, and that's at the expense of the whole world, as well as at the expense of Ukraine. And so this is not good at all. Food being weaponized. It's just horrible. And it's getting worse out there, from fuel costs, fertilizer costs, if you can even afford it, or if you can even get it in a lot of African countries. In Africa, 75-80% of all the food consumed comes from smallholder farmers. And a lot of them can't even afford it. And the debt now in African countries, because of COVID, et cetera, they can't afford safety net programs. And so what's going to happen in the next 6 months? On top of Ukraine, on top of Afghanistan, on top of Gaza, is not good. And here the U.S. is fighting over debt. And already we're seeing we raised $14.4 billion the last year from our donors around the world, mostly from the United States, for the World Food Program alone. And I helped a lot of other agencies get money. The messaging is clear, and it impacts a variety of agencies in the United Nations, for example. This year, only $6 billion has been raised. So the distraction of war and conflict in Gaza and other places is going to be, and is catastrophic, because the World Food Program is cutting now, for children, men and women, all over the world. And places that were fragile are going to be destabilized in the next 6 months.
I appreciate talking about the importance of communication, not just, I think a lot of our listeners just get into the work and focus on that, but the importance of telling people about the great work. Let's go back to the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm interested, if you'd be able to share that process. How are you, I understand it's the World Food Program that was awarded it. How are you notified about that? I watched your acceptance speech in preparation for this. But if you could talk a little bit about that process and then traveling there.
Street
talk. Sorry, Dave. And then also, of course, how that, you mentioned that elevated your profile and the profile of your messaging. So the importance of that.
The year before we received it, Street Talk was, we might get it. Who knows? But somehow that got to us, and hey, we were in the finals, and I don't know. So we were like, oh man, that'd be amazing. So, they announced it on a certain day, generally at a certain time. So we were, get the suit on, get ready, have a speech ready, and we didn't get the phone call. And I told my team, I said, do not ever bring this up again. Do not think about it. Let's just do what we do. And if it happens, great, it happens. And so the day I was in Niger that they were making the announcement. I didn't even know it was that day. I just didn't want anybody to talk to me about it. And so I'm in Niger, and I'm walking at like 6 a.m. in the hotel restaurant. So we're about to go out to the field in a really hard place where you had ISIS and Al-Qaeda on north and south, and we were trying to, break a conflict in terms of moving food supplies and deconflict the area. And happened to be the Norwegian ambassador was there. I didn't know him. He says, "Hey, Governor, y'all want to get the Nobel?" I said, "Oh, no, please don't bring this up to me. Don't bring it up to me." And I laughed and went on my way. And later that day, after we'd been to the field and negotiating with the military, because the military was keeping us from moving supplies, and if we don't move supplies, then ISIS, Al-Qaeda, other extremist groups use, the breaking down of a supply chain system to starve them from food or medicines or whatever, and then they recruit, right? And so I was just hammering with the military. I've got to have access. Here's what's going to happen. You will have more ISIS and more Al-Qaeda if we don't get food in there. And mothers are telling me my son didn't want to join ISIS, but we hadn't fed our little girl, his sister, and yada, yada. And about that. And my phone was literally upside down on the table, coffee table with the general. And it was just blowing up. Extraordinary. I'm like, what the heck? Inside, what's going on? And by that time, somebody busted in the door. Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm like, oh, wow, who won it? You did. We did. I was like, wow, what a moment. And so that was a game changer. So the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, in my opinion, was doing two things. I think first they were saying, thank you, World Food Program, for your women and men who put their lives on the line every day to feed the poorest of the poor around the world. And number two, the worst is yet to come. We want you to use this prize as a way to elevate the message to the rest of the world.
So there's an understanding in the committee that whoever they're awarded to,
I'm guessing that
that message will be elevated globally.
Of course, when you get a Nobel, it puts you on front center stage. And obviously, I exploited that every way I could. Speaking around the world, elevated the message. My message really didn't change. Mm-hmm. It just took the message to a whole nother level.
Yeah.
And we were able to go from 10 billion, 12 billion, 14 billion. And I do think receiving that award helped us to do that. And so it's a game changer. You just don't get that phone call.
Yeah, that's something special.
Yeah, really.
That's something really special.
Is.
Well, to wrap up, David, what are you working on now, or what are you working on next? Are there any projects you'd like to talk about? Or
Well, I mean, I've taken a break, but I did 1,000 flights in 6 years, and I.
Not trying to break that record in the next 6 years?
No, not in the next 6 months anyway, but I'm taking a break for me is still working 50, 60, 80 hours a week, and so I'm doing a lot of charitable work, speaking to a lot of groups, speaking to leaders around the world privately, saying, hey, you got to do this, and speaking to members of the House and the Senate, White House, we've got to fund these things, not just the World Food Program. Doing a lot of speaking for free for corporations, big companies, and I'm really hitting them hard, that you're not going to end the problem of poverty unless you really engage. And I appreciate your charity, philanthropy, great, not opposed to that, but that's not going to solve it. You've got to engage and take ownership in communities around the world, communities in the United States. How do we end hunger and poverty in that area of Chicago, in that area of New York? What can you do? Use your expertise and let's engage. Let's do it. Let's go together. And so I'm really hitting them pretty hard. If you believe in capitalism, and we've had so much success in the last couple of 100 years, then you've got to prove that capitalism helps the poor. And if you're not going to do that, I'm telling you, the young people will rise up and destroy the system that's given us so much success. And so we've got 10% we still have to reach. Let's reach them. Let's do that around the world. And so that part, I'm spending more time on university campuses now. I'm trying to inspire young people. Don't lose hope. You are the hope. Don't let this destroy democracy. Don't let this destroy human rights and freedom and liberties. This disinformation, you young folks, you got to figure this thing out. And the young people are really responding. So who knows what I will be doing next, but right now I'm out there in the vineyard speaking to people, trying to rally up the troops. Don't be so negative. Don't be so depressed. There's hope out there. A friend of mine told me one time, he said, All the darkness in the world can't put out the light of one little match. Be that match. And imagine what happens when 3, 4, 5, 100 matches come together. It's like a combustion of love. Most powerful weapon on the planet is love.
Thank you for tuning in to the Aid Market Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with Mike Shanley on LinkedIn to stay updated on the latest USAID funding trends.